Well, hello, my name's Trevor Burnard. I'm the Wilberforce Professor of Slavery and Emancipation and the Director of the Wilberforce Institute at the University of Hull. The Wilberforce Institute is an institution devoted to, a research centre devoted to the study of historical slavery and trying to eradicate modern slavery. So it does both, it connects both the contemporary and historical world. My accent, if you can get it, is that I'm originally from New Zealand. Taught in various places in the world and have an expertise in particular, I guess, in the Atlantic world and in the plantation colonies of British America, both British North America, but British West Indies. So I've done a lot of work on Jamaica in particular, which may be the subject we'll be talking about in particular today.
Yes, we're going to be talking about your article, which I will post in the show notes here, that the pack of Knaves, Royal African Company, the development of the Jamaican plantation economy and the benefits of monopoly. So if you could begin by just kind of giving us an overview of what the Royal African Company was and what happened to it.
Okay, great. Well, I'll start off with a disclaimer. Is that the biggest disclaimer is that my article in some ways defends the Royal African Company against some of its detractors. And it's a little bit difficult to do, given that the Royal African Company is not an institution that anyone would want to support, given that its major activity was in trade with Africa, and the biggest trade with Africa was the trade in human beings. So it remains, I think, probably, I might stand corrected with some of the 19th century, but it remains the largest carrier of humans from Africa, certainly in the 17th century, and perhaps perhaps throughout the 17th and 18th century, at least to the British colonies. The Royal African Company was set up in 1662 by Charles II. And we need to remember, it's something I think that people sometimes forget, and certainly the royal family often wants us to forget, is that the royal family is hugely implicated in the slave trade and slavery right from the start. It was set up by Charles II. His brother James, Duke of York, after whom New York is named and who became James VII and II, was the governor of the Royal African Company in the 1680s. And that's very significant because, of course, James VII and II, as a Catholic, as a much hated king, was overthrown in 1689 in a glorious revolution by William of Prince of Orange and his wife, James's daughter Mary, and forced to flee. This was a huge problem for Royal African Company because, of course, they were very much James's Royal African Company. So when he fell, it caused them immense political problems. The Royal African Company, its major activity was going to Africa, acquiring African captives from African merchants in those areas, and then providing those African enslaved people to colonies in the New World. Some went to North America, the great majority went to the West Indies. Barbados was particularly important, but by the late 1670s, 1680s in particular, Jamaica was becoming a more important place for enslaved people. And the Royal African Company, which has very good records, so we know a great deal about, and it's kept a great deal of records on who including whom they sold enslaved people to, and all the details of their finances, etc. The Royal African Company was the major provider of enslaved people to the Americas. It had a couple of problems, however. The first and most important was that the demand for enslaved people was insatiable among planters and merchants, but planters in Jamaica, just to use Jamaica as a case study, and also in other parts of, also in Spanish America. So the Royal African Company could never provide enough enslaved people to satisfy demand. The other thing was that it was highly political, so that it was very much associated with particular governors, It was the most important financial player by a huge margin in the colonies, and it attracted both fervent defenders, but more importantly, fervent opponents who believed that the Royal African Company was restraining trade, was stopping the island of Jamaica from developing to its full potential, was not benefiting the leaders of society, particularly rich merchants and rich planters, and was was a source of corruption. My particular article wants to say that the one thing that people haven't talked about, well, go back one point. Then in the 1690s, there was a ferocious campaign against the Royal African Company, leading to the ending of its monopoly in 1698. And it meant that the Royal African Company, unlike its twin, the East India Company, was open up to what they called private traders. So the slave trade became, in essence, and this is slightly anachronistic, but it became, in essence, moved from being a monopoly trade under mercantilism to something which was as close to free trade as you can imagine in the early 18th century. It meant that large numbers of merchants in London, Bristol, later on Liverpool, entered the slave trade and went to Africa themselves, where they acquired enslaved cargoes and brought them to Jamaica. And the Royal African Company lost a political battle and became, even though it lasted until 1752, it became far less important in the colonies than it had done beforehand. So it's an interesting story, I guess, of both of Jacobean and early Georgian politics, but it's also a study of the economics of building plantation societies in the New World.
Yeah, and it's that building plantation society that I found most enlightening in your article, because once we kind of admit that we're talking about human beings and the slave trade is abhorrent and disgusting and all that, we are now kind of shifting to how the big plantations came to be, and kind of how rich dominates poor, and then how the article is incredibly rich in kind of how the process worked.
Yeah, but I'll sum it up very, very quickly, I guess, and to an extent, my article is in some ways a class-based analysis of what happened in this particular period, because what happens from the 1690s to the 1720s, and this has been established by brilliant scholars like Bernard Bailyn of Virginia in 1959, Edmund Morgan in one of the great books, Early American History, American Slavery, American Freedom. It's been established for Virginia, later on for South Carolina, but also occurred in Barbados a bit earlier, as Richard Dunn pointed out in Sugar and Slaves from 1972, and then in Jamaica, as I've been talking about in various parts of my books. In this particular period is one of the most crucial periods in American history. And it's crucial in a couple of ways. The first one is in the 1690s, just about everything in America is going badly. I mean, if you're going to pick the worst year in American history, some of you now would pick perhaps 2021, bearing in mind January 6th, but I would go for 1692, which is the Salem witchcraft trials, yellow fever in the Caribbean. It looks like everything's falling apart in these sorts of ways. And we see from the 1690s to in the 1700s, a dramatic change. And the dramatic change is the birth of the most important class in American history, and that's the Southern and the West Indian planter class, who, through their control of enslaved people, through their ability to create these large plantations, what they call a large integrated plantation, where everything is incorporated on a plantation, through their access to land, develop into a consolidated elite, richer than any group of Americans that ever existed before, richer probably than any group of Americans and West Indians, certainly until the second industrial revolution, until the ages of Rockefeller, etc. A planter class which dominated the American South, dominated, of course, the West Indies, not just in the 18th century, but in the case of the United States of America, right up till very close to the American Civil War, when they, of course, precipitated a rebellion and ended up destroying themselves. So you have really from the 1690s through to the 1830s in the West Indies, and a bit longer perhaps there as well, and certainly into the 1860s in the American South, you have a very important planter class. And what my article wants to say is that this was not something which just came about by accident. It was something which was precipitated by politics, by the ability of the planter and their merchant friends to develop things for their own benefit, and it involves very closely the Royal African Company. So my contribution to this debate is that, and it ends up sounding like I'm defending the Royal African Company as the friend of the poor, which to an extent I am, but it's a friend of the poor who was also involved in the selling of enslaved people. So we're not talking about it. No one's on a good side at in this particular area. But what I'm saying is that if we look at what was happening in Jamaica, as well as what was happening in London, which is where usually people talk about the ending of a Royal African monopoly. What we see there is that the ending of a Royal African Company monopoly contributed mightily to the growth of the most significant ruling class in American history, which is the West Indian planters and the American and the planters in the American South. Which is in many ways is my argument in a nutshell. Although of course my article spends a lot of time trying to prove that, and also having to prove that by dealing with suppositions rather than actual evidence. It's one of the most difficult things, is that this is a period of American history about which we know least. I mean, I think if I just ask you put you on the spot and said, can you think of a major person or a major event in the 1710s? Most people, perhaps yourself, would find it very hard to think of anybody like that. Yet it's a period of major transformation in American and West Indian history. And the change of the end of a Royal African Company monopoly, which allowed poor people a chance to own enslaved people, and the beginnings of the separate traders going to selling enslaved people, which greatly, which brought a huge increase in the number of people that could go to the African captives that went to the New World. But it also meant that those African captives were increasingly bought by a smaller and smaller percentage of the population who used them to develop very large plantations. So I'm saying that if you look at on the ground, the end of the Royal African monopoly contributes to and can be connected to a major socio-economic transformation in early 18th century American history. And that socio-economic transformation is one of the most important transformations in the whole period of American and West Indian history. So if you accept my argument, it deals with something very significant historiographically.
Yeah, I found it very convincing, especially when you brought up the use of credit and how credit functioned, not only in how the Royal African Company provided credit, but then what it became afterwards, I suppose, and how that contributed to the smaller versus the larger slave-owning populations.
No, see, I think that's a very interesting one. I mean, one of the ways the Royal African Company, when James II and VII was abdicated in 1689, in the 1690s, it found itself with two particular big problems. The first one was it was closely associated with James VII and II, so it's on the wrong side politically of things. The second one is that it's hugely in debt. And why is it hugely in debt? Is because it was providing massive amounts of credit to people buying enslaved people in the Americas. The cost of an enslaved person, and I'm sorry having to deal with these, it's rather distasteful talking about humans in terms of price, but that was what the reality was. enslaved people were never as cheap as they were in the 1680s. And that's because the Royal African Company was able to use its monopoly powers to buy enslaved Africans in Africa at pretty low prices. It had market power to do so, and it was able to sell them to people in the New World, particularly in the West Indies, also at pretty low prices, extending massive amounts of credit to them. And that credit only sometimes got repaid. So that therefore, what you see with the Royal African Company is that in effect, it was providing a massive loan to the development of American and West Indian companies. And I guess if you wanted to think of a contemporary thing about the contemporary moral about this, is that sometimes we always think that America and the West Indies were founded on free trade, private enterprise. That's not incorrect, but it was also helped by massive government spending on things like infrastructure. And one of the biggest spendings was the Royal African Company's spending on what we might call labor infrastructure. Once again, we're always talking about horrible sorts of ways of talking about a huge human tragedy. But without the Royal Africans' use of credit, that would have been very difficult. What happens after the Royal African Company monopoly is finished is just as interesting. All the advocates of getting rid of the monopoly said that once the Royal African Company goes, we'll be able to get many more slaves at much cheaper prices. So the customary way that you would always defend free trade right up and private enterprise right up to the present day. Well, they were half right. The private traders were able to get a good deal more enslaved people to go to the Americas. However, they did not have the monopoly position that the Royal African Company had in Africa. So African merchants were able to push up their prices. So one of the big winners from the Royal African Company, in the Royal African Company's monopoly, were African merchants, the people who traded and enslaved people in Africa, the people who sold the African captives to Europeans, and they did so at a greater price, which meant that when enslaved people came to the Americas, they cost more. For planters, for poorer people, that was a real problem. They no longer could afford quite as easily to get enslaved people unless they worked on plantations and were given advantages by planters. Planters were able to buy more because the plantations were making a good deal of money, but they also needed a great deal of credit. And what happens, of course, in this case is that unlike the Royal African Company, whereby people without many resources were given loans, many of which didn't work, private traders were much tougher. And so they would only give credit to credit-worthy people, which means that you actually have, therefore, a real change in the nature of slaves. In the 17th century, people tended to buy enslaved people for their own uses, using the credit of a Royal African Company. So customarily, people would buy 1-2 enslaved people, use them on their farms rather than their plantations. After the separate traders come into place in the early 18th century, after the end of the Royal African Company monopoly, what happened then is that separate traders would sell to merchants in particular, because merchants had lots of capital. Those merchants would then buy up the majority of enslaved people, and then they would sell them on again to planters in larger parcels than there before. So what you see developing is, to put it crudely, is that there's both a wholesale and a retail market in enslaved people that previously hadn't existed. And this, as I argue in my paper, largely benefited the wealthier planters more than it did anybody else, and it led to a considerable increase in inequality, as well as an increase in wealth for the larger planters in this period.
But then that also necessitated a balancing act on the large planters, large enslavers, plantations to manage the poorer white non-slave owners. And,
That's right.
and maybe you could speak a little bit on how that trick was accomplished.
Well, I must admit, this in some way, and this comes out of a book where I lay this out called Planters, Merchants, and Slaves, where I lay it out much more fully. And I should say that much of what I say in some ways is supposition, though I'm pretty convinced it's correct, rather than having as much clear evidence as I wanted to have. But in essence, my argument would be that except in Barbados, which moved towards a large plantation system very quickly, in other parts of the Americas, Virginia, South Carolina, Jamaica, the move to the large plantation system was quite slow. And that's quite surprising because Barbados in 1680 was easily the most successful colony in America. Adam Smith, writing in 1776, says, when we go back a century, all we see are places of no worth whatsoever, except for Barbados, which is very flourishing. In other words, what the societies they had in Jamaica in the 1670s and Virginia in the 1670s and 1680s, the years of Bacon's Rebellion and all those sort of things, South Carolina after it's founded in 1680s as well, is societies which were pretty good for small people. And in other words, it was very, very difficult to build a big sugar estate. Because what you need with a sugar estate, first of all, you need money. First of all, then you need labor and you need capital to build things. But you need, in particular, you need people who could control enslaved laborers. So if you imagine it, is that you have a whole lot of enslaved Africans, many of whom are very skilled in military training, young, male, extremely angry, not prepared to work in gang labor, which no one really wants to be a sugar laborer. So you have a highly explosive situation. And we know in Virginia, with white people in the 1640s, with Bacon's Rebellion, that any people who are having to work in sugar as laborers really have a really difficult time. Very few white people wanted to do that. They could make money from being involved in Jamaica anyway, from being involved in piracy. They could have small farms whereby through the Royal African Company, they could get 1 or 2 enslaved people to work those particular farms. They could have a very good life without getting involved with sugar at all. However, over time, land gets more expensive. Poorer whites get forced out of the small farming. There's at least in Jamaica, there's a war against pirates, so piracy becomes less of an option. And poorer whites find it, particularly after the Royal African Company is abolished and the price of enslaved people go up, they find themselves left with a problem, what to do. And there's a sort of, I guess you might say, a horrible bargain which is made, which is in return for large salaries, they worked on the plantation where their major job was in disciplining enslaved people. I used Colonel Jack by Daniel Defoe in the 1720s to talk about this. And we have a lot of the things of what they call ordinary whites, cowskin heroes was a later term for them, who would use, who would treat enslaved people very badly. And one thing that I think, even though I'm not quite sure I can entirely prove it, but I think it's highly likely, is that an awful lot of these poor whites were not just people who had relatively little option but to become plantation workers. They also had military experience, so they were used to the discipline of the army, and the army is the single biggest institution, which is most like the plantation, both in terms of lockstep labor, but also in terms of the really harsh conditions you've put them under. So for someone who's been, say, a soldier or a soldier in the armies of the 1690s, or someone who's been a sailor involved in looking after and mistreating enslaved people on slave ships, when you work on a plantation and you have to deal with 30, 40 enslaved African men, usually who will kill you at a moment's notice and have the capacity to do so, you're a lot less fazed by that than other people. so what it strikes me is that what I've always sort of thought is that one of the biggest issues to do with the rise of a plantation is not such things as the invention of gang labor. That was fairly obvious. Was not even credit getting enslaved people into work. It's making them do things they don't want to do. And so you have to find people, and they found them among poorer whites who are willing to do that really, really hard work of disciplining slaves. And in return for that, they got good salaries, but they'd also be sponsored by planters, for example, who were always cash poor, but they would say, well, we'll extend you our credit rating and you'll be able to buy enslaved people yourself. So slavery became, the buying the slaves became something which cemented whites together in this period. Which means, I think, that often when people talk about this period, they talk about it as the beginnings of racism, is that what happens is that whites developed a sense of whiteness against blackness. I don't disagree with that. I think that's very, very true. But I think also that you can explain why whites came together against black people in the early 18th century, and where race relations became much, much more rigid than they had done before. I think you can explain it through the particular economic circumstances leading to the rise of a large plantation and the creation of an intermediate class, subalterns you might say, an intermediate class of poorer whites who did the hard work of disciplining enslaved people, but were increasingly connected to the richer planter class than before. I think one thing, just as an aside to that, it's often assumed, and it comes out in people like Ed Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, and goes up to the present day, is that whites became a caste, which I think is in some ways true, but it's a caste that would we be connected with each other. And I think, you know, if in terms of slave rebellions and those sorts of things, which were quite frequent in places like Jamaica, whites did band together. But otherwise, poorer whites had their own initiatives, and they were by no means as easy to control as rich white planters sometimes supposed that they would be. And we see this throughout the 18th century in things like the American Revolution, later on with Virginians. Poorer whites would sometimes agree with what rich planters said, but often wouldn't.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in the article you bring up is kind of this bribe of white people and kind of what they got out of it. I think you know, that touched on a lot of it. And I think yeah, the rich won and the poor lost is what is kind of what it comes down to. In your
people who really lost, of course, were the
slaves. Yes, yeah.
And I think that's one of the things I really want to emphasize is that the history of slavery is not constant. It's not the same. It varies. And this is the period of perhaps the greatest degradation of Black life in the Americas. So that they're working extraordinarily hard on things like sugar, which killed massive numbers of enslaved people. The violence was extreme by anybody's estimation. The laws were ferocious, etc. So what it means is that the rich planters, absolutely, and the rich merchants won, and they became the wealthiest and most important class in American and West Indian history. Poorer whites lost in some ways, but they gained in other ways. And enslaved Africans lost out considerably. But unfortunately, and it's a hard thing to say, is that the enslaved people were always going to lose out. The other winners, of course, are African merchants who increasingly find the selling of enslaved Africans more and more benefit, and in some places would transform their societies into places which were weren't diversified economies, but were providing enslaved people to Europeans. And by that way, even though the individuals were being rewarded, they were destroying much of the economy of their society. There's a lot of what historians would call the tragedy of the commons, which goes on in this particular episode.
Well, and I think I'd kind of just like to end with this, one of the things that you touched on in the beginning, and really jumped out at me when I was reading the article, was that the whole of the British Empire and the colonial project during this period was unified to enable slavery and the slave trade. And I think if we could just kind of maybe make that point a little.
Well, I think it's very important, because one of the things that we talk a great deal about now is the important, at least in Britain we certainly do, is the role of slavery in building up the empire, building up all sorts of things like that. And then we have the abolition of slavery later on, and certainly one of the criticisms that sometimes people about Britain have is that we were so proud of ourselves for abolishing slave trade in 1807 that we sort of forgot that that Britain was extremely dependent on slavery beforehand. But in the period that I'm talking about, particularly around the abolition of the slave trade monopoly, there was not a single white voice which was raised in support of enslaved Africans or against slavery at all. It was assumed that the only way you could make money out of the New World was through slavery. And slaves were making massive amounts of profits for all sorts of individuals, but for ordinary people as well were involved in it, because of course what mostly enslaved people made, if they were in Virginia, they grew tobacco, in the West Indies, they grew sugar. Both of those things were highly desirable. The consumption of sugar went up and up and up in the 18th century. Europeans, especially the British, have a great sweet tooth. Puddings, sugar and tea, all those sort of things are associated with it. And I think that one of the things we need to remember is that from the 1670s and 80s, when the British colonies really started to institute slavery, up until, I would say, really to the American Revolution, but at least to the end of the 7 Years' War, every institution in British society and in American society, certainly in the South, was united in defense of slavery, the slave trade, and those sorts of, and both of those things as an essential support for commerce and for the nation. And what that meant for enslaved people, of course, is that their chances of escaping enslavement were minimal. Their chances of getting freedom were close to infinitesimal, and how they had to attain some value in their life was through other things rather than escaping slavery. From the 1780s onwards in Britain, round about that time in the American North, and then continuing for the next 60 years, you see a big change. You see a continual battle between those people who supported slavery and those people who opposed it, and that's much of the course of American history. But that means we forget, I think, because of that contestation and how important it was, we forget just the complete unity that just about everybody in society, British or American, had towards slavery up until at least after the American Revolution. Both Britain and the the colonies that became the United States, and the West Indies, of course, were totally committed to slavery. Very few people were opposed to it until very, very late. And certainly the period that I'm talking of, the early 18th century, it was axiomatic that slavery was the only thing that made the colonies worthwhile.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point that it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle of the discussion of all of this. So thank you for that. Is there anything else you would like to add as far as the article that you feel we didn't cover? Or
no, yeah. Well, the only small thing I'll try and be very brief. Is that one of the things I would recommend to your readers is to think of America in a more expansive way. Is that when we're looking at early America, it's not the United States. It's the North America and the West Indies. And certainly the West Indies up until about the 1740s or 50s was the major part of the empire, at least for those people in Britain who were caring about what empire was and who thought in particular about the money that coming into the period, into the place. So that when we think of early America, I think it's really, really important to remember that Jamaica and Barbados is just as important for early American history as are Virginia and Massachusetts.